Welcome to today's episode of the Magnetic Masculinity podcast. My name is Sandy. I'm your host, and this is my co-host, Austra. And today, this topic is so important because hidden trauma in men is actually what is preventing a lot of amazing men on this planet from experiencing their most fulfilling life. This is the barrier that is preventing you from optimal health, amazing, fulfilling relationships, and the happiness that you deserve, that is your intrinsic quality within your soul.
So, talking on the trauma, how would you define what trauma is? Because I think especially when it comes to men and how men might perceive trauma, they might think that it's if you come from a war or you have gone through really severe traumatic experience, that's where you get the trauma. What is your perspective on that, or what would be your comment on that perception of it?
I definitely agree that all of those traditional definitions of trauma, like you were in a war and you watched people die, or you were beaten severely, or you lived through, a horrific experience or a car accident or your parents dying, are how we classically identified trauma. Now, with newer understandings in psychology and neuroscience and understanding the human nervous system, the definition of trauma has definitely changed, shifted, and includes things that we would maybe refer to as micro traumas. But micro traumas doesn't make them less impactful. In fact, I would propose that sometimes it makes them harder in your life because we don't spot them, and men aren't taught to see what they are, and men don't understand them. So it causes internal conflict. It causes anger, disassociation, abusive behaviors, feeling unfulfilled. And it really is a big barrier to deep connection in relationships, and no different. So let's look at what trauma might be. Let's take a classic example of a veteran. Thank you, everybody, for your service. Veterans who experienced a lot of trauma in war. They come home, and every time they hear gunshots or fireworks or a car backfiring, they go into an emotional flashback, and their nervous system and their brain behaves as if they are still in that situation, which was emotionally stressful and unresolved. While you're in a war, while you're in, the middle of a bombing, you don't have time to sit and breathe through your emotions and release that trauma from your body and let that fear go through and witness it and presence it. You just have to suppress it. It becomes one of those giant emotional beach balls we talk about. Now, in what is often referred to in psychology as CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is from emotional flashback or more emotional flashbacks. So say in childhood, you were running in the park and you fell down and a kid laughed at you. And you were like, and your body went into a fight, flight, freeze mode. It went into a traumatized mode. You didn't feel safe. You felt something. And you ran up to your mother, and your mother said, "Oh, suck it up. You're fine. You're a tough boy." And that again becomes unresolved. You just freeze it or you suppress it. And then later on in life, something happens and you have an emotional flashback. Or a very common example when I'm speaking to couples or men is, think about somebody saying to you, "Hey, we need to have a talk later." Your partner says that to you and you go, and you either start lashing out or you freak out or you feel shut down, you feel anxious, you feel nervous. Nothing has happened yet. You're having an emotional flashback. So men, especially because they're taught to be tough and taught to suck it up and taught to suppress their emotions instead of letting those experiences move through them and alchemizing those emotions and learning from those emotions and receiving the love and safety and approval and connection and secure attachment that they need to resolve those emotional wounds in the moment. They're forced to suppress them, ignore them, deny them, disown them, reject them, disidentify from them, which later on in everyday life and relationships causes these little wounds. So let's say a man has let's say 25 emotional wounds, and they're little like wounds on their body. Imagine they have these little wounds, these little emotional wounds in their nervous system, in their brain, and they don't know they're there. And they've been, the skin has grown over them, so they don't know they're there, but underneath they're festering, they're infected, they're festering. Anytime somebody touches it, even if they touch it gently, they're going to go ow, and they're either going to go ow and they're going to shut down, or they're going to go ow, you hurt me, right? And they're not going to know what's happening, and they're not allowed to express emotions, nor have they been taught to identify or process emotions. So a lot of men walk around carrying these relational or attachment traumas from childhood, traumas from living in our currently evolving toxic culture, emotional dark ages. They might have religious trauma, like being told if you masturbate, you're bad, you're a sinner. And then they might get emotional trauma around sexuality, or again, not being validated and seen and heard and allowed to feel emotionally safe and step into their full authentic selves, because everybody is an emotional being. And when we're not allowed to express those emotions, and they're invalidated and gaslit and bullied and teased and taunted and forced to be tough and suppress all of those things, over time, all of these unresolved wounds, they still live within your body. There's a lot of work right now in the trauma fields and psychology fields around somatic, like cellular memory. There's also epigenetic trauma. So if your father and your great grandfather fought in the war and they have all of that trauma in their cells and their DNA, they know now that can actually be passed down in utero. So we have societal trauma, we have personal trauma, we have emotional trauma in our key relationships in childhood. We might have trauma in school. Say somebody said, I'm working with a kid right now who this other kid at school keeps telling him he's stupid and ugly. That can be a trauma, right? A trauma is just something that impacts you negatively that is unresolved. And again, you can look at really exaggerated, really obvious examples like that, of like a veteran with PTSD from a war. And then we can zoom that in and look at how something similar is happening to people, especially men, around their emotional traumas.
How common is that, like micro trauma or trauma? Because there might be men listening who are like, well, I don't think I have any trauma in my life. And with that, are there ways how men that might think that could, or something they could think on, or any like prompts for them to ask themselves to identify if there is any? So the
Yeah,
question is kind of like two-sided. How common is it, and how can men listening identify if they have any?
great question. So I would say it's really common. I mean, I think even the most well-intentioned parents, the most well-intentioned caregivers, the most well-intentioned teachers, we didn't know as much, in my era of growing up, certainly not in my mother's era of growing up, and certainly not in my grandparents' era of growing up. You know, they might have maybe used to make kids wear dunce caps. They used to spank their bare bums and give them, boundary violations. They say, well, it made me tougher. Yeah, but how did being tougher help you connect with others? So if you have amazing relationships and you feel fulfilled and you feel happy and you feel connected and appreciated by those around you, then you might not have any. But I would say that's probably a pretty small percentage of the population. So why don't we look at what common trauma responses are? The classic ones were fight, flight, and freeze. Those were the classics. Now they've added fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and sometimes fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fib. And fib is one that very much comes up in neurodivergent studies. So on boys with ADHD or anywhere on the autism spectrum. So let's look at what those might. So when your nervous system is overwhelmed, it sort of cuts off your ability to think logically because you're in fear. You're in primal panic. You're not in your big, manly, strong. You're in primal panic. And these then become automatic reactions. So fight is like fairly an obvious one. It's fight. I have to lash out to protect myself. And what that might look like in adulthood is anger, aggression, being really controlling, lashing out at people, snapping on people, that would be an indication that you might perhaps have a proclivity towards fight. Flight is to flee whatever you do not have the skills to process, which for men emotionally was pretty much everything because they weren't allowed to have emotions. So flight often looks like avoiding things, just avoiding la 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 la, or numbing things. So that can be like emotional eating, drugs, alcohol, masturbation, pornography, anything like that. Or overworking, just constantly being on the go, 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 go. Oh, I'm going to go for a drive. I'm going to do chores. I'm going to work out. I'm going to go play pickleball. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. Now I'm going to go golfing. I need a project around the house. That's what it can look like. And then freeze is the something's happening. I don't know what to do. And you just freeze. And that can look like being numb in adulthood or disassociation, just sort of like people might say to you, like, what are you listening to me? You know, like your wife might say, are you listening to me? Where are you going? Why are you ignoring me? You might just shut down. It's just shutting down. So you're just overwhelmed, and the only strategy that your little nervous system and all your little conditioned parts have is to just freeze. They don't know what to do. They're like, this is like what rabbits do, you know, when they're provoked. They just freeze and they play dead, or they just freeze and then they die of a heart attack. And then fawning is like, so I've done all of these. So fawning is like, you might notice in adulthood, if you're a people pleaser, if you're always validation seeking, if you're constantly worried what everybody thinks of you, and you're really conflict averse. So fawning is like, if I am so nice to you and I'm so vulnerable, you can't hurt me. So think of a dog when you meet it, it rolls over on its back and pees on itself. Right? It's like, I'm not a threat. I'm not a threat. I'm not a threat. Here, you're the boss. You're the boss. You're the boss. Here, here. That's what fawning is. And so if we look at a dog example, fight would be, and I see this with my dogs all the time, or I see this with children when I talk to parents about conscious parenting. So if you're not allowing a dog, if a dog's coping mechanism is to flee the scene and it's on a leash and you're not allowing it to flee and it can't freeze because there's something bothering it, it's going to fight. It's going to bite, or it's going to roll over on its back and go, don't hurt me, don't hurt me, don't hurt me, don't hurt me. Same as children, right? So in adulthood, these things can be a little bit trickier to spot, and we might see them as personality traits, but they would be, if we go back to our magnetic masculinity blueprint, they would be signs of your conditioned self, not your authentic self. So again, yeah. And then one of the ones that's more recently been added is fib, which is to tell a lie. I don't have a coping mechanism to get out of this. I don't know how to allow my feelings. I'm worried about you judging my feelings, so I'm going to lie. And as we get into adulthood, these behaviors start to not only impact our own self, because when we're not in authentic alignment, it doesn't feel good, but it very much impacts our relationships. And these are what I would say would be the core causes of things like being emotionally abusive or emotionally invalidating or aggressive, or all of these things that people used to call toxic traits in men. A more kind way to look at it is primal panic, CPTSD, unskillfulness, or pain. Right? Unfortunately, though, sometimes not always, depending on which one of those coping mechanisms, which one of those trauma responses your nervous system gravitates to, it either becomes very self-abusive or very unpleasant for others.
So these are the trauma responses. And can you explain the mechanism of how they work together with the flashbacks? Like what's the process there? What triggers what, or so that men listening can understand, and maybe with that you might add an example of how does that look like versus what would be the healthy situation?
Okay, so let's say in childhood, every time your father came home from the bar, he was really mean to your mom, and your mom would cry and you felt unsafe and you would feel like you had to protect your mom. But every time your dad went to the bar, he wore his red coat. So it could be something like every time you see the color red or somebody wearing a red coat across the street, you start feeling, you start feeling something and you don't know what it is. You just think, oh, that person I'm talking to irritated me, or, your brain will just make up excuses for what it is. But that emotional flashback, not dissimilar, although different, to a war veteran, right? When the fireworks go off, they're not in a bombing, but they're in an emotional flashback, and their body and their brain and their nervous system goes into that fight, flight, freeze, or fib or fawn panic reaction, and they're experiencing it as if it's happening right now, because the brain doesn't know if something is happening now or in the future or in the past. The brain doesn't really know the difference, right? It just releases the same chemical formula. Let's release 5 parts cortisol, 2 parts adrenaline, 6 parts this, lower testosterone, whatever it's doing, that we experience as an emotion or a shutdown or a rage or whatever our mechanism is in our body, is that emotional flashback. So let's say you didn't feel like you were approved of for being emotional by your parents in childhood, and they'd be like, go upstairs until you're done being angry, instead of allowing you to release your anger healthily. Or they were like, boys don't cry, suck it up, whatever it was. In adulthood, what this could look like is your partner says, I need to have a talk with you, or let's sit down, or I'm really pissed at you. And you don't have those emotional coping skills. You're going to go into an emotional flashback. Or let's say your father used to yell at you or hit you. Anytime somebody shows conflict with you, your brain and your body's going to go, help, I'm unsafe, I can't handle this. And you're either going to lash out at your partner, you're going to start fawning to your partner and people pleasing them, you're going to freeze and disassociate, or you're going to avoid it and you're going to hightail it out of the room and be like, I'm not dealing with this, gone, and you're out of the house. So it's not really necessarily about what's happening in that moment. It's not really about what that person is doing or saying. It's about a memory. Often, again, if we go back to the magnetic masculinity blueprint and look at the brain is like your computer interface of your soul or consciousness. And it has all this computer software, all these algorithms. And when it experiences what it perceives as an old familiar pattern from childhood, it says, oh, okay, I know what to do. Boop. And it types in that chemical formula that we instantly experience in our body of unsafety, fear, unworthiness, guilt, shame. And we bring that forward with us into adulthood. And that would be our conditioned masculinity, or your conditioned masculinity, rather than who you authentically are. It's miswired software that is impacting your brain, your heart, your energy levels, and your emotional navigation system. So the whole vehicle seizes up. And it's based on something that happened in the past, similar to a vet, only a war veteran, except it would be something that you might look at and go, oh my God, that's so weak. Who cares about that? Don't be such a sissy. But your programming doesn't override your autonomic nervous system or your parasympathetic nervous system. It doesn't override those things, right? That's your thoughts about masculinity, but your body and your little child self, who probably didn't have the safety and stability and emotional validation and secure connection that little boys need and deserve in childhood to feel safe. And they probably didn't have that safe place to release and express and allow emotions to move through them, which is actually one of the gifts and strengths of the divine masculine, and to allow women to have their emotional and hormonal fluctuations and not make them bad or wrong and be able to hold those. But when men can't hold their own emotions and they've suppressed them and they have that CPTSD or that emotional trauma, and women show emotions, then they again either have that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or fib response. And it really impacts not only their happiness, their ability to be present, but their relationships.
So with these moments of experiencing those flashbacks, the question I have is, one is to acknowledge that, okay, that's a primal panic or emotional response or flashback,
Yeah.
but what if it's hard to accept it? And the question there is coming from a place of where I feel like a lot of men, they're expected to be competent. It's like one of the
Yeah.
expectations from men to always be competent, to always be in charge of themselves, their situation, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, so how to manage that when in some ways you like as you go through that flashback you might feel out of control, or you might
Yeah.
feel like, oh, this shouldn't make me feel this way, this is nothing, yet here I am feeling
Yeah.
this way or reacting, or even worse, I now have done something and I felt or said something and I feel regrets about it, or I need to address it.
Yeah. That is a hard one. And I acknowledge that it's not going to be comfortable per se, but there is nothing braver, stronger, more manly, more sexy than a man who is willing to learn and grow and evolve and own his shit. Remember that none of these things you did when you were, let's call it conscious versus unconscious. Like right now, I'm like, you and I are having a conversation. You could say anything to me and I'd be fine. My husband walked in the room and said, oh, Sandy, you failed at such and such. And if it was something that my parents used to scold me for, I might in that moment go into an emotional flashback. And then I'm not in my rational mind. I'm not. We could call that unconscious or emotionally triggered. People call that triggered, emotional flashback, reactive, fear, primal panic. Pick your metaphor. They're all the same thing. They're just different metaphors for the same thing. PTSD, they're all metaphors. But when we're in that state, there's no point in beating yourself up for what you did when you didn't know better. You're not in control during that time. I'm sorry, but you're not. So if you want to get more control, you're going to have to acknowledge those things. We're going to have to make the unconscious conscious. We're going to have to take you out of primal panic and back in the driver's seat of your vehicle of consciousness. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is through awareness, acceptance, self-compassion, and whatever tools work for that individual. But I acknowledge that it can be tricky because then, as the expression goes, hurt people, but your trauma is not your fault, but it is your problem, as they say. So there is nothing, again, braver, stronger, more manly than learning, growing, evolving, becoming an evolutionary leader and saying, that's it. I am redefining what it means to be a man. I am setting a new precedent for men to step into their full power, which includes the emotional navigation system. I will be able to hold myself in the driver's seat more often. I will be able to provide more support for the women and children in my life. I will be a better leader and I'll actually be in control more often. Because when we're trying to control things, when we're not in control, it's actually the opposite of control. So if you want to be in the driver's seat more often, it's going to, and if you want to rewire your brain to welcome these opportunities, is celebrate them. That's how you level up in this game of life, is you reintegrate all these disowned pieces of yourself, the angry part, the abusive part, the weak part, the crying part, whatever all these parts are, right? If we go back to our episode on the Magnetic Masculinity Blueprint and our episode on parts work, if you haven't watched those, I advise go back to the beginning of this podcast and then you'll get a little more metaphorical context. But this is bringing some of those parts home, right? And we want to give all those parts a seat at the table of your consciousness. Give them a chance to hold the talking stick and make them feel welcome, love, and belonging. Give them a chance to hold the talking stick. Otherwise, if they're in your subconscious, every time you get triggered or go to an emotional flashback, they're going to grab the talking stick and they're going to facilitate your less adorable, less evolved, less fun parts. And that's just not going to be fun over time. And it's going to damage your health, your happiness, and your relationships. But I do acknowledge that that is a hard paradox. Men are taught they have to be competent, and which again is part of the problem, right? They have trauma around you're not allowed to be weak, you're not allowed to fail, you're not, you have to be in control all the time. And And those things themselves can become a trauma that prevents men from actually stepping into that in an authentic way because they're so busy trying to prove those things from an underlying energy of shame or trauma. It's like building this big, amazing castle on a broken foundation.
So you mentioned trying to be in control when you're not in control. How does it look like?
Well, the most important thing you can do is become aware. Because as soon as you're aware that you're in the shit or that you're lashing out or that you're freezing or that you're shutting your partner out, thank God, now you're in awareness. And now you want to let that emotional flashback pass before you take action. And you want to let that emotion complete through your body. You want to let it, you want to give it what you needed as a child, which was somebody to come and say to you, like, it's okay. I got you. You're going to be okay. I'm here with you. You're safe. I'm not going anywhere. Like, it's that, like, almost that feminine, emotional, like, I got you energy. Like, I'm here. You're not alone. And we want to give that to that part, or like you would as a father. If your daughter came to you and said, I fell down and this happened and that happened, you'd be like, you'd wrap your big, strong arms around her and you'd say, I love you. I got you, baby. It's okay. I'm here. Nobody does that to boys as much, or not always, not nobody, but that's not typically what's done to boys. So if you have a little part of you that's in primal panic and he's like a 5-year-old, you want to just be like, it's okay. And we'll actually do an episode where we talk about different strategies because different tools work for different people. And if you've tried, breath work or meditation or cold plunging or whatever, and it hasn't worked for you, that's okay. It just means it's the wrong tool for the wrong person for the wrong job. We'll find one that works for you. But one of the first things you can do when you're in that is give yourself 60 seconds, say, I need a minute, and just breathe and just allow that to move through. Research shows that it takes about 60 seconds if we don't engage it. Now, if we get anger come up, like, how dare she accuse me of not taking the garbage out? It's not that you actually cared that your wife said you didn't take the garbage out again. It's probably true that you didn't take the garbage out again, but you might be in an emotional flashback because you're making it mean you're not good enough. And you're flashing back to a time in childhood where your mom said, can't you do anything right or something? And in that moment, you created a trauma. Now you're in an emotional flashback and you're about to lash out and go, well, you never do the dishes, or you're allowed to, or you freeze, or you start going, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Whatever your trauma response is, it's going, whoa, wait a minute. Taking a minute and recognizing. And now if say your response is anger in that moment, if she says, you never take the garbage out, and you start getting rage, if you start feeding that rage and feeding that rage and feeding that rage, it's going to create momentum, right? There's a law of physics that says, I think it's 17 seconds of an energy to be in a particular form before more of that energy comes. So think of it like your anger train. It's okay that there's an anger train, but if it's in the station and you let it go and go and go, and then it builds up momentum and builds up momentum and builds up momentum, and now it's like it's cruising down, it's cruising down one of the fastest train tracks in the world. It's going to be a lot harder to stop than it is when it's just starting to chug out of the station. So it's not about stopping it. It's not about suppressing it. It's about not engaging in it. It's about going, oh, I'm in an emotional flashback. Give yourself a hug, ask your partner to help regulate with you. And I want to be cautious about using the word regulate. I don't love the terminology that's being common right now about regulating your emotions. I think regulating your emotions, to me, at least to me, sort of implies judging or suppressing them or being like, I'm going to get rid of this emotion. It's not like that. It's more like let it pass through, recognize that it's an old emotion, allow it to come through without feeding it or blaming it on somebody else. Just allow it to pass. Usually might take about 60 seconds. And if you comfort yourself through that and you breathe through it, you're not going to feed it with like, yeah, she's such a jerk. She doesn't know. Nah. Oh, she never does this. She does. And then you're going to start, the thought train's going to start going, and then your thoughts are going to build up momentum. The computer's going to start firing. Then the emotional navigation system's going to react. Then you're going to create a feedback loop, and then it's going to create a mood, and then it's going to, it's going to linger for longer. But you do want to allow that fear allow whatever that emotion is, whatever your response is. Take breaths. And again, we have a handout that we'll offer in the comments that you can have that gives you different tools and modalities to help you recognize and move through these trauma responses, CPTSD, emotional flashback, triggered, activated, upset, primal panic, fear, unconscious moment. Pick your metaphor again, they're all valid. And then once you are actually back in charge, let's say not even say in control, once you're back in charge and you've said, wow, that's great. Don't beat yourself up for having that unconscious reaction. Congratulate yourself for your awareness. Because as soon as we're in awareness, none of your parts are holding the talking stick in a hostile takeover. It means you, the CEO, you've got the talking stick again, and your job is to mentor or parent or heal or accept or listen to those parts. And then that completes. And then the next time that thing happens, you may not have a PTSD response to it. You may not have a trauma response to it. And that's great because over time you become stress resilient and trigger proof. And that's a lot more fun way to live. And yeah, I think we're also going to do an episode on what some of these core wounds are in men. And we're going to talk about attachment wounds and the mother wound. But something I do want to touch on is a concept I teach that I call radical compassion. Because what I don't think is helpful, here's what I often see this awareness of men learning about their trauma looks like. I either see it look like it was all my mother's fault for not knowing how to love me properly, and my father's fault, and all of these people's fault for hurting me, which causes more separation and more anxiety and more anger and more injustice in the body. And what we don't want it to look like is passing that on to our partners and our children and our coworkers and other people either. And then how I've experienced it at times is I've been in relationships with men where I'm like, oh, I think you're in an emotional flashback. The way you're treating me right now, I recognize that you're in primal panic, but it's not okay to speak to me that way. And it's not okay to treat me that way. And this is not my fault. This is a wound that we can heal together. And what it sounds like is, well, I was raised by a narcissist, so it's not my fault. And I'm like, well, what I hear is, yes, you have unhelpful software in your brain and nervous system that is not helpful. And it was caused because somebody treated you abusively. So how do you think it affects me if you treat me abusively? So I'm not saying that this is an excuse for unaligned behavior, but it is a reason. So radical compassion is compassion for yourself, not telling yourself to suck it up, not telling yourself to not be a pussy, not telling yourself. I had a client last week say, well, I don't want to be such a pussy. And I was like, I didn't think anybody actually said that anymore, but bless your heart. Okay. That's still a narrative that's going around in somebody that's only in his early 30s. So it's not doing that to yourself. It's compassion for yourself, acknowledging your pain, acknowledging your wound, acknowledging the trauma, acknowledging yourself with compassion. It's not your fault. You didn't deserve it. You didn't manifest it. You didn't ask for it. It's not your fault. And then that radical compassion, we start with ourselves and we treat ourselves with lots of compassion. And then we build up a momentum of compassion. Like we were talking about how thoughts and emotions build up momentum. We hold on to that. We build up momentum. Then we spread that momentum of compassion to the people that impacted us with their unskillfulness, right? Well, if my father was a narcissist, yeah, it definitely did impact me. But why was he like that? Because somebody impacted him. And that doesn't mean that we invalidate our pain ever. Doesn't mean we don't acknowledge our trauma. It doesn't mean we don't acknowledge our pain. It just means eventually, not before we're ready. You don't force this. If you're not there yet, that's okay. Don't force emotions. Meet ourselves where we're at. But eventually we want to get to the point where we have compassion for those that have impacted us and where evolutionary divine masculine grad school comes in. This is your PhD, is you want to acknowledge how your programming is impacting others and have compassion for those that you've impacted with your unskillfulness. So it's that radical compassion, which keeps us out of like, well, I didn't mean to hurt you. It's not my fault. My father beat me when I was a kid. And it doesn't look like, well, I behave this way because my father beat me as a kid. it's my parents' fault. Or in the case of more subtle trauma, it's more like your really well-intentioned parents who loved you a lot, didn't know how to love you properly and didn't know how to create secure emotional attachment for you, which isn't their fault either. It's not ever about fault. It's about compassion, acknowledgement, awareness, empowerment, and healing. So that radical compassion, again, compassion for yourself, because you were impacted and it wasn't your fault. You didn't deserve it. It's not who you are. And you don't even know you're doing it. So it's, until it's in your awareness, it's not even something you can control. So have compassion for yourself and have compassion for the people that didn't know any better either. Because think about how your grandparents were parented. They were wearing dunce caps and they were trying to figure out how to get food and going through wars. And they had to toughen up because they lived in a really terrifying environment. And they weren't able to be soft and squishy. It's not their fault, but it is a problem, right? Hurt people, not on purpose. And then again, expanding that compassion into compassion for those that we've impacted with our unskillfulness. And compassion feels a lot more fun than anger, guilt, shame, which again, there's nothing wrong with anger. There's nothing wrong with guilt. There's nothing wrong with shame. And it can be very healthy to move up that emotional scale, to move from hopelessness and panic to anger. Some guys get angry in our sessions and I'm like, oh, thank goodness, this is great, because they've been in hopelessness. So anger is at least a more empowering emotion. I'm not going to expect them to go from that to, I love everyone and I acknowledge that I've been emotionally invalidating and emotionally traumatizing and bullshitting my family for 2 decades. And it might start with anger at their parents. Great. Let's start there, but let's not live there. Let's make the goal of healing more of that divine masculine, like being able to hold everything and include everything. And, the entire universe exists within you. That's all of the good qualities, all of the crappy qualities, and not judging any of it, but seeing all of these behaviors as we evolve out of the emotional dark ages as information that alerts us. Is my partner, my boss, my coworker, my assistant, are they here with me right now, or are they in a conditioned primal panic? What do I need when I'm in a conditioned primal panic? And when we're more compassionate and more aware and more accountable to our own, we're not going to be as impacted by others, because we're going to see it for what it is, a cry for help, which does not mean allowing ourselves to be abused, mistreated, and you still get to have boundaries, because boundaries are an act of love. But it means that you won't take things personally, and you'll be able to help yourself and others through and healing and releasing those traumas that they have, right? Nothing's personal. Same as when you're reacting to somebody saying, hey, let's have a talk tonight, or you never take the garbage out. You're not reacting to what's happening in that moment. You're reacting to something that you're thinking, or you're reacting to something that happened 20 years ago. So is everybody else, right? So it helps you not take things as personally either.
With not taking things personally, how to distinguish between reality and what feels like reality in that moment?
That is a great question that we could do a whole episode on. I would say everything is real. But when you're piloting, like, everything you experience is real. So, people say, oh, that person's overreacting to something. There's no such thing as an overreaction, right? It'd be like telling a war veteran, oh, you're overreacting to that fireworks. It's just fireworks. You don't know how big the wound is. There's no such thing as overreacting. Now, where you want to be accountable is that if your partner says, you never take the garbage out, and they feel like they're not being seen and heard, and you flip out on them and you yell at them and you invalidate them, or you tease them, or you taunt them, or you shut down, or you avoid them, or whatever it is, that your reality is true and so's theirs, right? Remember, this is a multidimensional reality. So a lot of things are true at once. I am feeling overwhelmed and attacked, and I know that person's not actually attacking me. And I know that if I lash out at that person as if they are attacking me because I felt attacked by my parents in childhood, that I'm behaving in a way to them that they're going to experience as traumatizing, and then they're going to behave poorly. And. So over time, evolutionary mastery, one of the things I love to help and empower men to do is when you're successfully piloting that vehicle of consciousness and you're in your authentic alignment, it's recognizing, it's awareness, it's metacognition, which is the awareness. And only once you're in awareness can you start to navigate and heal. And then you, over time, you are going to be less reactive, but it's learning to question everything. It's learning to, what am I making it mean? Are things that I ask myself. What am I making it mean? When else have I felt this way? You know, that's also where I like shadow work, or owning your awesome and owning your shit, as I call it, where we look at, you know, I have a workbook here because I'm working with a client in a few minutes on this, where as if we're constantly triggered. Say, for instance, I worked with somebody yesterday who often in childhood because he was not listened to and his parents never believed him and they punished him very inappropriately for things. He developed the coping mechanism that had a very positive intention of lying, right? So he would go into fib. He would fib to avoid unfair consequences. That's a valid coping mechanism, right? It's a valid thing to do. So by looking, but now in adulthood, he hates when other people lie. And when I ask clients, I'm like, what's one thing you'd never want to be called? He's like, I would never want to be called a liar. I'm like, but you do lie pretty frequently. So you are kind of a liar. But we want to give that part of you a seat at the table. We want to find out what its positive intention was. And only once you hear it and see it, and you, as the CEO of that table or that boardroom of your consciousness, only once you give every part a seat, let it have a chance to hold the talking stick and make it feel love and belonging, it's no longer going to need those strategies. These are all strategies to get needs met. That's why I focus so much in the blueprint on authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values, because you either get a need met. And in childhood, most of us did not get our emotional needs met. Therefore, we had to develop strategies in our child brains to meet needs or to avoid punishment or to create boundaries. And those were the best we could do. Those parts of us are trying their best. They have no bad intentions, but you eventually over time want to be that CEO. You want to be that loving, wise adult, that brilliant leader who's going to help these parts learn new strategies so that you can have a more fun, fulfilling life and less drama in your relationships and feel less triggered and less upset and less stress over time.
The last question I have is on the compassion. Like, what did you say to somebody who is listening and they might have some resistance or some fear of becoming too soft with compassion, like compassion, because usually it's not the goal of that men have to become more soft or squishy.
That's fair. That's fair. But I would ask, okay, I know some men that are like earning more than $1 million a year. They've got ripped bodies, really fit, really good looking, really smart, and really kind to others, really good listeners, really good leaders. Their wives love them. Their children adore them. People want to be around them. They're empathetic. They're self-aware, right? Magnetic masculinity is embodying all of the parts of the masculine. It's not necessarily about being soft and squishy. It's about knowing when to be soft and squishy and when to boss up. It's about knowing when to put your foot down and lay a boundary and when to open your heart and see that somebody else is in distress. And unless you remember in the magnetic masculinity blueprint, in your vehicle of consciousness, your heart is the battery and emotions are your navigation system. And if you don't open those channels up, you're only ever going to be thinking with your head and you're going to be exhausted. You're not going to be as connected to other people. People aren't going to like, love, admire, adore, appreciate you as much. And you're never going to be able to bridge that gap between achievement and fulfillment. So I'd say there's actually nothing stronger and braver and more manly than a man who can hold all of that. And you want to talk about what women want? If you're a man who can hold your own emotions and experience and express your emotions in a healthy way without taking them out on others, and then you're not going to judge or freak out or avoid or distress or manage her emotions and the emotions of your children and the emotions of your coworker, you're going to become magnetic. That is why it is called the Magnetic Masculinity Blueprint, and people are going to be drawn to use like drawn to you to you like moths to a flame. And you're going to feel empowered, inspired, confident. Other people are going to be inspired by you. You're going to be self-aware, which means you're going to be unconscious and out of control actually less often. And you're not going to feel the need to control. You're going to be connected to your intuition. You're going to have fulfilling relationships. You're going to pursue things that genuinely fulfill you at the soul level. So if that involves getting a little uncomfortable on the journey there, I'd say that's a time you can suck it up because it's going to be worth it.
All right, so that's the trauma or like the first episode of going into trauma a bit more. Anything you want to add?
No, that's great. And if you are experiencing trauma, I just want to tell everybody that trauma is no joke. And there are lots of professionals who have trained for decades in trauma. I've taken several trauma-informed courses and programs and certifications, but there is still psychologists who specialize in very specific types. You might have a very extreme type. You may have a very severe type. Don't be afraid to seek help, right? Wisdom is not knowing all the answers. It's knowing who to go to for the right answers to teach you the things that you need to eventually become autonomous and in charge, so you don't have to run around trying to control everything. And just remember, it's not your fault. You didn't cause this. It's brave to be willing to look at it, change it, shift, heal, and lead humanity and lead and take that leadership role of men and guide us out of the emotional dark ages by looking at what's not working and figuring out how to fix it or change it or heal it or integrate it, I think is better than fix it, because we don't want to fix those parts. We want to integrate and heal those parts.
All right, so that's today's episode. As always, comment below if you have any questions. There's also a link to where you can submit any questions you want us to address during the episodes, and share it with people so that we can reach more people, help more men, and spread this insane knowledge.
There's also a link where you can book they're free for now, strategy session where we can map out your unique magnetic masculinity blueprint, and I can help you figure out the perfect diagnostics to figure out what's preventing you from experiencing your most fulfilling magnetic life in the shortest amount of time, so that you can never have to worry about missing out on your most fun, fulfilling, and magnetic life.
All right. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye for now.